She was 34 years old, and by every measure the town of Ridgehollow used to count a person's worth. She had nothing left to her name but a borrowed shawl, a tin cup, and a small leather pouch holding $7.40. Her husband had been gone 2 winters by then, taken by a fever that the doctor could not name and the priest could not stop. And the small homestead they had built together had been swallowed back into the bank's ledger before the second frost. So when Maranza Doyle stood at the back of the canyon auction that pale October morning, the wind tugging at the hem of her morning skirt, and raised her hand to bid on a battered freight wagon that had been hauled half-broken out of the dry bottom of Crowfoot Canyon, the men around her laughed openly, slapping their knees, calling out that the widow had bought herself a coffin on 4 wheels. They did not know, and neither did she, that beneath the warped pine planks of that abandoned wagon's floor lay a secret that had waited nearly 30 years in the dark. A secret that would not only lift her out of her sorrow, but would unbury an old crime the town had long since agreed to forget. Settle in by the fire, friend, and let me tell you the story of Maranza Doyle. If you have ever been counted out, written off, or laughed at for choosing the thing no one else wanted, do say so in the comments below, for this is a tale told for you. Maranza had come into the world in a small mill town east of the Sangers, the only daughter of a wagonwright named Eustace Doyle, a man whose hands smelled forever of cedar shavings and linseed oil, and whose voice was as steady as the lathe he had worked for 40 years. He had taught her the trade not because he wished her to take it up, but because she had refused to leave his workshop as a child, perching on a flour barrel with her chin on her fists, watching him plane the long curve of a wagon tongue or peg, a spoke into a hub. By the time she was 12, she could shape a felloe by hand, and by 16 she could tell a sound axle from a doomed one by the way it rang when struck. Her father had died of a slow cough the year she turned 20, leaving her his tool chest and a small carpenter's plane he had carried since his apprenticeship, its rosewood handle worn smooth by his thumb. That plane she kept wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside her trunk, and she would have sold her own shoes before parting with it. She had married a quiet man named Hollis Doyle, a distant cousin who shared her surname by happy coincidence. And together they had moved west to Ridgehollow because the railroad was said to be coming, and a man with willing hands could make a living there. They had built a cabin of cottonwood and stone at the edge of the sagebrush flats, and for 6 good years they had been happy in the small, ordinary way that costs nothing and matters most. Then the fever came, and then the bank came, and then Maranza was alone in a town that had once tipped its hats to her, and now looked through her as if she were a pane of dirty glass. The man behind most of that looking through was Edmund Thrale, the president of the Ridgehollow Cattlemen's and Miners' Bank, a tall, narrow gentleman with silver at his temples and a watch chain of woven gold across his vest. He was not a shouting man, and that was the worst of it. When he had summoned Maranza into his office to inform her that the note on the homestead could not be carried any longer, he had spoken in the polite, measured tones of a schoolmaster correcting a sum. "The world, Mrs. Doyle, is held together by ledgers," he had said, folding his long white fingers upon the desk between them. "Sentiment is a luxury for those who can afford it. You cannot. The property reverts. I trust you will conduct yourself with dignity." He had not even looked up when she rose to leave. He had only turned a page. Edmund Thrale had come into Ridgehollow nearly 30 years before, a young clerk then, riding in on the same wave of dust that had brought the first surveyors and the first hopes of a rail line. He had risen quickly, married into a ranching family, bought up notes from failing homesteaders, and by the time Maranza arrived in town he owned the bank, 2 cattle outfits, the only proper hotel, and a great deal of the silence around certain questions no one asked anymore. Among those questions was what had ever become of the Crowfoot Mining and Freight Company, which had once promised to make Ridgehollow a city, and which had collapsed in a single black week in the autumn of 1879 when its payroll wagon vanished somewhere in the canyon and its workers, unpaid, drifted away into the wider country with curses on their lips. There had been a hearing of sorts, and a report had been filed, and the report had concluded that the wagon had been taken by bandits and that the gold was gone forever. Mr. Thrale, then a young banker, had signed his name to that report. The men whose wages had vanished had signed nothing, because most of them could not write. Maranza did not know any of this when she walked out of the bank that afternoon with her $7.40 and her father's carpenter's plane in her satchel. She knew only that she needed a roof and a way to earn bread, and that the boarding house run by a widow named Cora Biddle had a small upstairs room she could have for $1 a week if she would mend linen in the evenings. She took the room, she mended the linen. She drank weak coffee in the kitchen and listened to the wind under the eaves and tried not to think of the cabin she would never see again. It was Cora Biddle who told her about the auction. Cora was a round, sturdy woman of 60 with iron-gray braids pinned up like a crown and a laugh that could shake soot from the stovepipe. And she had a habit of knowing everything that happened in Ridgehollow before the people it happened to. "They're selling off what the county hauled out of Crowfoot last spring," she said one evening, setting a plate of beans before Maranza. "Old freight wagon. Been laying down in the canyon for I don't know how many years. Cottonwoods grew up around it. They had to chain it to 2 teams of mules to drag the thing out. Nobody wants it. They'll auction it Thursday for the cost of the haul." She looked at Maranza over the rim of her cup. "Your daddy was a wagonwright, weren't he?" Maranza nodded slowly. "He was," said Cora, and said no more. On Thursday morning, Maranza walked the half-mile to the county yard with her father's plane in her satchel and her $7 in her pouch, and she stood among the men at the back in the cold autumn light, and she looked at the wagon. It was a sorry thing to look upon. Its canvas top was long gone, leaving only the bent ribs of its bows like the rib cage of some great drowned animal. Its iron tires were red with rust, and its hubs were packed with dried mud and old leaves. One wheel was cracked clean across 2 spokes. The tongue was missing. The brake lever hung loose. The bed of the wagon was warped and split, and the high sideboards bore the faded ghost of painted letters that no one had bothered to read in many years. But Maranza, who had been raised in the smell of cedar and linseed, looked at it differently than the men around her. She saw the heavy hardwood frame beneath the rot. She saw the iron strapping still sound. She saw in the curve of the bows and the depth of the bed that this had been no ordinary farm wagon. This had been a freighter built for serious loads, built by a maker who had known his work. The auctioneer was a thin man named Pell with a voice like a rasp file. He read out the lot in a bored sing-song, noted that bidding would start at $5 to cover hauling, and waited. The men chuckled. One of them, a cattle hand with a tobacco-stained mustache, called out that he would give 2 bits for the firewood. Another said the rats inside it had a better claim than any buyer. Pell smiled thinly. $5, gentlemen, $5 to take this fine vessel of the desert off the county's hands." Maranza raised her hand. The yard went quiet for a heartbeat, and then the laughter started, low and easy, the kind of laughter that does not even bother to be cruel because it is so sure of itself. A man near the front turned and looked at her and shook his head with a smile, and Pell, who had known her late husband, blinked twice before he recovered his rasp. $5, the widow Doyle. "Do I hear 6? No one bid against her. No one would." Pell brought the gavel down with a soft, embarrassed thump and said, "Sold for $5 to Mrs. Doyle. May God bless the transaction." Someone behind her muttered that she had bought herself a coffin on wheels, and another said she would have done better to set fire to her money and warm her hands at the blaze. Maranza paid her $5 in coin, signed the paper with a steady hand, and walked back to the boarding house with $2.40 to her name and the deed to a ruined wagon in her pocket. That night she did not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the upstairs room and listened to the wind moving across the prairie, and she thought of her father, and of the way he used to say that every wagon had a soul and that a wagonwright's job was only to listen for it. She thought of Holly's and of the cabin and of Edmund Thrale's white folded hands. And somewhere between the dark and the dawn she made up her mind that she would not let the laughter of Ridgehollow be the last words spoken over her. The next morning she went to old Silas Birch, who ran the livery at the edge of town and who had known her father long ago in another country. Silas was a small, bow-legged man of 70 with a face like a walnut and a habit of speaking only when he had something worth saying. He listened to her in silence, chewing on the stem of a cold pipe, and when she was done he spat once into the straw and said, "You ain't going to make a wagon out of that thing, girl." "Not in this life. I am not trying to make a wagon out of it," Maranza said quietly. "I am trying to make a home out of it, just for the winter. Until I can think." Silas looked at her for a long moment, then he sighed and reached for his coat. "I got a corner of the back lot you can have for nothing," he said. "And I got a tarp and some rope. I ain't got much else. You bring your own hammer." She brought her own hammer. She brought her father's plane. She brought everything she owned in 2 flour sacks and a trunk, and over the next 3 weeks she made of that abandoned freight wagon something no one in Ridgehollow had thought to imagine. She patched the canvas with sailcloth Cora Biddle gave her from an old awning. She wedged the cracked spokes and bound them with wet rawhide that shrank tight as iron in the cold. She cleaned the hubs and greased them with tallow. She set a small sheet-iron stove in the bed of the wagon with its pipe going up through a tin collar in the new canvas. And she banked the wheels with stones and earth so the wind could not crawl underneath. She slept the first night with her father's plane on the crate beside her head, and she woke in the dark to the soft tick of the stove cooling and the far-off cry of a coyote, and she did not cry, although she had earned the right to. The town watched, some pitied her, some mocked her. A boy named Tobin, 10 years old and skinny as a rail, took to carrying water for her from the hand pump at the livery without being asked, and would not take payment, although she gave him a biscuit each evening for his trouble. Cora Biddle came by twice a week with bread and gossip. Silas Birch said nothing for days at a time and then would appear in the late afternoon with a length of iron strap or a handful of square nails and lay them on her crate without a word and walk away. And Edmund Thrale, passing once in his polished black buggy on his way to the bank, slowed only enough to glance at the wagon and at the woman standing beside it in her patched coat. And his face did not change at all, which was, Maranza thought, the worst face a man could make. It was on the 11th day of her labor, kneeling inside the wagon bed with her father's plane in her hand, smoothing a warped board so that the stove could sit level, that she first noticed the thing that did not match. The floor of the wagon, she had assumed, was made of inch-thick pine planks laid directly upon the cross members of the frame. But when she set the plane down and tapped the board with her knuckles, the sound was wrong. It was hollow where it should have been solid. She tapped again in 3 places, and in 3 places the sound came back deeper than it ought to. She sat back on her heels in the dim red light of the stove and stared at the floor for a long while. Then she fetched her father's old square from the trunk and laid it across the bed, end to end, and measured the inside depth. And then she climbed down and measured the outside depth from the underside of the frame to the top of the sideboard. The 2 numbers did not agree. The inside was 4 inches shallower than the outside. Somewhere between the floor she could see and the cross members she could feel from below, 4 inches of wagon were missing. She did not tell anyone that night. She lay awake again, but this time it was not grief that kept her up. It was a low, steady humming in her chest, the kind of feeling her father used to call the wagon's voice. She thought of the painted letters faded on the sideboards. She thought of the heavy build of the freighter, of the iron strapping, of the canvas long rotted away in the canyon. She thought of how a man might build a false bottom into a wagon if he meant to carry something he did not wish the world to see. In the morning she went to Silas Birch. She did not say why. She asked him only what he remembered of the freight companies that had run out of Ridgehollow before the railroad came. The old man looked at her sharply over his cold pipe, and then he set the pipe down and folded his small hands in his lap. "There was one," he said, "Crowfoot Mining and Freight. Run out of the canyon mines up north, hauled ore down to the spur at 2 Forks and brought back supplies and payroll. They went under the autumn of '79. Lost their payroll wagon, so the story went. Bandits, they said. The miners never got paid. Most of them drifted off. Some starved that winter, some begged, some died." He paused. "My brother was one of them as worked that mine. He never saw a dollar of what was owed him." Maranza was quiet. "What happened to the company?" "Folded up like a bad hand of cards." The owners walked away clean. The bank picked up what was left for pennies. Silas looked at her and his old eyes were very steady. "Why are you asking me this, girl? I am not sure yet," Maranza said. "I will tell you when I am." She went back to the wagon and she worked through the afternoon and into the evening. And when full dark came, she lit her lantern and she set her father's plane aside and took up the chisel and the small claw bar Silas had given her, and she began, very carefully, to lift the floor of the wagon bed. She did not pry the boards, she unscrewed them. The screws were old square-headed iron, set deep, and they fought her, and her hands cracked and bled before the first board came up. But come up it did, and beneath it, fitted snug and dark with age, lay another floor of thinner pine, fastened with brass cleats that had once been polished and were now green with verdigris. It was a false bottom. It had been built into the wagon with great care by someone who had not meant for it to be found. She sat back and looked at it for a long time in the lantern light, and the wind moved against the canvas, and the stove ticked, and somewhere out in the dark a horse stirred in the livery. Then she fetched her father's plane, and she pressed her palm against its rosewood handle, and she said softly into the cold air, "Help me, Papa," and she lifted the second floor. What lay beneath was not gold, and that was the first and most important thing. There were no coins, no bars, no glittering heaps such as the old wives' tales liked to promise. What lay beneath was an oilcloth bundle, long and flat, tied with leather cords that crumbled at her touch. Beside it, packed in straw long since brown and brittle, was a small iron strongbox no bigger than a Bible, locked with a brass padlock whose key was nowhere to be seen. And tucked into a corner, wrapped in a scrap of red flannel, was a single envelope sealed with black wax, the wax stamped with the impression of a small bird in flight. She lifted the envelope first. Her hands were shaking, and she did not try to hide it from herself. She broke the wax and unfolded the paper, and by the lantern light she read the spidery, careful hand of a man who had known he was running out of time. The letter was dated September the 22nd, 1879. It was addressed to whomever finds this and has a soul left to use. It was signed by a man named Josiah Crowfoot, the founder of the Crowfoot Mining and Freight Company. Maranza read the letter 3 times slowly by the small yellow flame, and as she read, the wind outside seemed to go still, and the stove ticked, and her father's plane lay quiet beside her. And the whole town of Ridgehollow, sleeping in its little grid of streets beyond the livery wall, seemed not to know that the ground beneath it had just shifted. Josiah Crowfoot had written the letter on the night before he meant to drive the payroll wagon down through the canyon to Two Forks. He had written it because he had reason to believe he would not make it. He had been warned 3 days before by a railroad surveyor named Beale, who had since vanished, that the payroll would be taken not by bandits but by men in the employ of his own junior partner in the bank at Ridgehollow, a young man named Edmund Thrale, who had quietly bought up the company's notes and meant to drive Crowfoot under, claim the mines, and pocket the payroll as the final blow. The plan, the letter said, was to have Crowfoot ambushed in the canyon, to take the gold, to leave the wagon to rot, and to file a report blaming bandits no one would ever find. Crowfoot had not been a man given to fear, but he had been a man given to caution. He had taken the payroll gold and locked it into the strongbox, and locked the strongbox into the false bottom of the freight wagon. He had filled a second strongbox, a decoy, with lead shot and old coin, and that he had set in plain view on the wagon seat. If he survived, he would deliver the true payroll himself. If he did not, he had written, then perhaps one day an honest soul would find the wagon and find the proof, and the men whose wages he carried would be paid at last, even if from beyond his grave. The letter ended with a list. It was the most important part, and the part that made Maranza set the paper down very carefully and press both her hands to her face. It was a list of 73 names, each followed by a sum of money owed. Beside each name, in the same careful hand, was the man's mark, or, where the man could write, his signature. It was the company's payroll roster for the autumn of 1879, signed by the workers themselves before they had walked into the mountains for the season, and countersigned by Josiah Crowfoot as a record of debt. It was, in the cold language of the law, a contract. It was, in the warmer language of conscience, a promise. Marenza sat with the letter on her lap for a long time. Then she took up the small claw bar and she pried open the brass padlock on the strongbox, and beneath the lid, packed in oiled paper, lay the payroll gold of the Crowfoot Mining and Freight Company. Untouched for nearly 30 years, dull and heavy and real. She did not count it, she did not need to. She closed the lid and she closed the false bottom and she set the boards back into place and she screwed them down with steady hands and she put out the lantern. And she sat in the dark with her father's plane across her knees and she thought. She did not go to the sheriff. The sheriff in Ridgehollow was a man named Pelham who owed his job and his small ranch and the schooling of his 2 sons to Edmund Thrale. She did not go to the newspaper because the newspaper was owned by Thrale's brother-in-law. She did not go to the courthouse because the county clerk was Thrale's cousin once removed and signed every deed in the valley with a pen Thrale himself had given him as a wedding gift. She knew, sitting there in the cold dark of her wagon home, that if she ran into the street shouting what she had found, she would be called a madwoman, a grieving widow chasing ghosts. And the wagon would burn one night in a fire no one could explain, and the truth would go back into the canyon for another 30 years. So she did what her father had taught her to do when a board did not sit right. She did not break it, she did not curse it, she studied it, she measured it. She found the grain of it and she planed it slow. In the morning she went to Silas Birch and she told him everything. She showed him the letter. She watched the old man's face change as he read it, and she watched a tear track down through the lines of his cheek and lose itself in his beard. And she watched him fold the letter very carefully and hand it back to her. And she watched him stand and walk to the back of the livery and put his face against the warm flank of a horse and not move for a long time. When he came back, his old eyes were dry and he said only, "What do you need, girl?" "I need a lawyer," she said, "who is not from this county. I need a man who remembers the railroad surveyor Beale. I need to find the children and grandchildren of every name on that list. I need to do this quietly and I need to do it right and I need to do it before Mr. Thrale knows what I am doing." Silas Birch nodded once. "Then you have come to the correct, old fool," he said. "I will write the letters, I still have a hand for it. And I know a lawyer in Denver named Hollander who hates a thief the way most men hate the cold." So began the long, slow planing of the board. Through the winter, Marenza lived in the wagon, and the wagon became her workshop and her hearth, and Cora Biddle came every week with bread and gossip and would not be told anything, although she suspected much. Tobin, the skinny boy, carried water and asked no questions and was paid in biscuits. Silas Birch wrote letters, careful letters in a tight old hand, to addresses scattered across 3 territories, and slowly, the answers came back. A widow in Cheyenne who had been a bride in Ridgehollow in '78. A grown son in Salt Lake whose father had walked out of the mines in '79 and had drunk himself to death within the year, never knowing he had been robbed. A daughter in St. Louis who had been 12 years old when her father did not come home. A cousin, a grandson, a sister, a name. By the time the snow began to thaw, Silas had accounted for 51 of the 73. The lawyer Hollander had come twice from Denver by train, in plain clothes, and had sat in the wagon by the stove and read the letter and read the roster and looked at Marenza over his spectacles and said, "Mrs. Doyle, this is the cleanest case of fraud I have ever held in my hands. The signatures, the dates, the contract, the gold itself. Paper, madam, will fight paper. And this paper will win." She did not smile, she only nodded. "Then let it win quietly," she said. "I do not want a fight. I want a payment." In the spring, when the cottonwoods along the canyon were just beginning to leaf, the first of the heirs arrived. Marenza had asked them to come not all at once, but in 2s and 3s by different trains on different days, so the town would not notice. She met them at the livery. She showed them the letter in its frame now, behind glass. She showed them the roster. She showed them the names and the marks and the signatures of fathers and husbands long gone. She did not show them yet the gold. The gold she had moved, with Silas's help, in 3-night journeys to the safe of a bank in another county, a small honest bank run by a Quaker named Friend whom Hollander trusted. From that safe under Hollander's hand, the payments were made. Each heir received what had been owed to his or her family in 1879, with 30 years of simple interest reckoned by the lawyer at a rate so fair that none of the heirs questioned it. Each heir signed a receipt, each receipt was filed, each filing was countersigned. Paper began to answer paper quietly like a slow tide coming in. And Maranza, who could have kept a great deal for herself and would have been within her rights to do so, kept only what Josiah Crowfoot's letter had instructed in its final paragraph, which she had read aloud once to Hollander and once to Silas and never again. Should any portion remain when all debts are paid, Crowfoot had written, let it be used to mend what my failure broke. Let the mines be opened by honest hands. Let the town be fed. Let no man in Ridgehollow ever say again that a wage was not honored. She took, for herself, the price of a small house on the edge of town, with a yard large enough for the wagon to stand in. She took, for Silas Birch, the price of a new roof on his livery and a pension that would let him close it when he chose. She took, for Cora Biddle, the price of a proper kitchen at the boarding house, with a new range and a pantry that would never again be empty. She took, for the boy Tobin, the price of a pair of good boots, a winter coat, and a year of schooling at the Two Forks Academy, paid in full. The rest, every coin of it, she gave back to the town. She did not give it as charity. Charity, she had learned from Edmund Thrale, was a thing the powerful used to humiliate the poor. She gave it as wages. The schoolhouse, which had stood with broken windows for 6 years, was repaired by men who were paid a fair day's pay in cash, and the children of Ridgehollow, who had been learning their letters in the corner of a feed store, went back to it in the autumn with new slates. The general store, which had been closing its shutters at noon for lack of stock, received a standing order paid up front for flour, sugar, coffee, and salt, and reopened with its lamps lit until evening. The blacksmith, an old man named Pieter, who had not had a real commission in 3 years, was hired to forge a new bell for the church, and when the bell was hung and rung on a clear blue morning in May, half the town wept and did not know why. The widows, of whom Ridgehollow had more than its share, were quietly paid to mend, to wash, to bake, to nurse, to do the 100 small skilled things that a town requires and never names. The roofs were patched, the fences were mended, the streets were graveled, smoke rose on cold mornings from chimneys that had stood cold for years. Through all of this, the name of Maranza Doyle was scarcely mentioned. The money came instead through Hollander, through Friends' small bank, through proper contracts and proper receipts, in the name of an estate trust called simply the Crowfoot account. The men and women who received its payments were given to understand only that an old debt of the Crowfoot Mining and Freight Company had at last been honored, and that the courts had ordered it so. The story, as such stories do, began to be told in pieces in the kitchens and on the porches, and the pieces slowly came together. By the time summer came, there was scarcely a soul in Ridgehollow who did not know that the widow who had bought the abandoned wagon for $5 had found something inside it, and that the something had been honest, and that the honest thing was setting the town back on its feet. Edmund Thrale knew it first of all. He had known, in fact, from the moment the first heir's letter had arrived at the post office under a name he recognized from a ledger 30 years old. He had sat in his office with his white folded hands upon the desk and had said nothing for a long time. Then he had risen and walked to the safe behind his chair and had opened it and looked inside, and what he had seen there, what he had always seen there, was the small leather notebook in which he had kept in his own hand the record of what he had done in the autumn of 1879. He had kept it because powerful men always believe in the small private chamber of their hearts that they will one day need to prove their cleverness to someone. He had kept it because he had not believed in that small private chamber that anyone would ever find the wagon. He did not burn the notebook. There would have been no point. Hollander, working through the spring and summer, had already obtained, by subpoena and by patient testimony, the affidavit of an old man in Oregon who had been a clerk at the Ridgehollow Bank in '79, and the deposition of the railroad surveyor Beale, who had not vanished after all but had only fled to Canada and lived these 30 years under a different name in a small fishing town and had been waiting in his own way for someone to ask. Paper answered paper, ledger answered ledger. The county clerk, faced with documents he could not deny without committing his own crime, signed the corrections that restored to the heirs of Crowfoot the legal title to the mines and to the freight company's old holdings. The newspapers, first in Denver and then in Cheyenne and at last, reluctantly, in Ridgehollow itself, began to print the story. They printed it carefully and they printed it slowly and they printed it with documents attached. Edmund Thrale was not arrested. The crime was 30 years old and the law in those days was uncertain about such matters, and Hollander had judged, with Marons's quiet agreement, that a public trial would only give the man a stage. What happened instead was quieter and worse for him and more just. His partners in the cattle outfits, reading the newspapers, withdrew their accounts. His depositors, hearing the story whispered at every supper table, came one by one to the bank and asked for their money back, politely and without raising their voices, until the bank could no longer meet its obligations. His brother-in-law sold the newspaper. His cousin resigned from the clerk's office. The sheriff Pelham, who was not a bad man, only a frightened one, came to Marons's door one evening with his hat in his hand and asked her forgiveness, and she gave it to him, because she had nothing else useful to do with it. Edmund Thrale sold his hotel. He sold his house. He sold, at last, the bank itself to a consortium out of Denver that included, by a quiet arrangement Hollander had made, a portion of the Crowfoot account. And then, one gray morning in October, almost exactly a year after the auction at the county yard, Edmund Thrale boarded the eastbound train at the Ridgehollow depot with 2 trunks and a small leather valise, and he rode away. No one came to see him off. He did not look back. He did not, so far as anyone in Ridgehollow ever heard again, speak the name of Maronza Doyle aloud for the rest of his days. She did not watch him go. She was, that morning, in the yard of her small new house at the edge of town, planing a board for the workbench she was building inside the old freight wagon, which she had drawn up beside the house and which had become her workshop. Tobin was carrying a bucket of water from the new pump she had set in the yard. Cora Biddle was on the porch with a basket of mending, talking to Silas Birch, who had taken to dropping by in the afternoons and who had at last agreed, after some persuasion, to let Maronza paint a new sign for the livery, which read DOYLE and BURCH, WAGONS, repaired and built, in tidy black letters with a small carpenter's plane drawn beneath. The bell of the church rang noon, clear and bright over the sagebrush flats, and somewhere down the street the blacksmith's hammer answered it, ringing on iron, ringing on iron, the way Maronza's father's hammer had rung in the small mill town east of the Sangers long ago, when she had been a child on a flour barrel watching a wagon take shape under his hands. She set down her plane on the bench. She wiped her palms on her apron. She stood for a moment in the doorway of the wagon, looking out at the yard, at the town, at the long pale grass moving in the autumn wind. She thought of her father. She thought of Hollies. She thought of Josiah Crowfoot, who had written a letter on the night before he died and had trusted, against all the evidence of his life, that one day an honest soul would find it. She thought of the 73 names. She thought of the men who had laughed at the auction and were not laughing now. She did not feel proud. She felt instead very quiet, in the way a person feels quiet when she has at last set down a weight she did not know she had been carrying. If you have ever been counted out, friend, if you have ever stood at the back of a crowd while better-dressed men chuckled at your choice, if you have ever picked up the thing no one else wanted because something in you whispered that it still had a soul, then this story has been told for you. The world will tell you, in the cold, polite voice of Edmund Thrale, that value lives only in ledgers and land and the good opinion of important men. The world is, in this as in many things, mistaken. Value lives also in the careful hand of a father teaching his daughter to plane a board. It lives in the patience of an old liveryman writing letters by lamplight. It lives in a letter sealed with black wax and waiting 30 years in the dark. It lives in the choice to be fair when you could be greedy, and quiet when you could be loud, and patient when you could be cruel. Thank you, friend, for sitting by the fire with me through the long telling of Maronza Doyle's story. If it has warmed something in you, share it with one other soul who needs reminding that forgotten things can still hold great worth. and that the people the world throws away are sometimes the very ones who find what the world has buried. And tell me in the comments below if you would, has there ever been a thing in your own life, a tool, a letter, a place, a person that others wrote off as useless and that you found, when you looked closer, to be the most valuable thing of all? I will read what you write, I always do. Until we meet again by this fire, walk gently, listen for the wagon's voice, and stay close.